You ever had one of those nights where you're out running errands, but something just feels off? That was me a few months back, wandering through Walmart at 2 a.m. I wasn't there for anything exciting, just milk, eggs, and maybe some chips. The late-night crowd was sparse, the kind of mix you'd expect. A couple of night shift workers, a college kid in pajamas, and me. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead like they were trying to outdo the awkward silence of the store. I was in the snack aisle, debating between barbecue and sour cream chips, when I heard it. A faint tapping sound, like fingernails drumming on metal. It wasn't loud, but in a near-empty store, it might as well have been a firework. I glanced around but didn't see anyone. Just rows of shelves stretching into infinity, and the dull reflection of the lights on the polished floor. Shrugging it off, I grabbed my chips and headed toward the back to check if they had any ice cream left in stock. That's when I noticed him. A man, or maybe just the shape of one, standing at the far end of the freezer section. He wasn't moving, just standing perfectly still, his head cocked slightly to the side like he was listening for something. I stopped mid-step, my cart squeaking to a halt. Something about him made my stomach clench. Maybe it was the way his arms hung stiffly at his sides, or the way his head tilted just a little too far, like a marionette with its strings tangled. I couldn't see his face. The overhead lights cast shadows that swallowed his features. "Hey, you good, man?" I called out, my voice echoing eerily down the aisle. No response. He didn't even twitch. I kept telling myself it was just some weird guy who probably didn't hear me, but something deep in my gut was screaming otherwise. Still, I didn't want to be that paranoid jerk who freaks out over nothing, so I pushed my cart a little closer, just enough to see if he'd snap out of his weird trance. As I approached, I noticed something odd about his clothes. They looked old. Not vintage, but dirty, worn down, like he'd been rolling in dust and grease for weeks. His shoes were scuffed so badly they barely looked like shoes anymore. And his skin, what little I could see of it under the shadows, looked gray, almost sickly. "Hey!" I said again, a little louder this time. "You all right?" No reaction. He didn't flinch, didn't move, didn't even seem to breathe. That's when I realized something else. The tapping sound was back. But it wasn't coming from him. It was behind me. My heart jumped, and I turned sharply, expecting to see someone, or something. The aisle was empty, just rows of cereal boxes and shelves stocked with canned soup. I scanned the area, even leaned my head around the corner, but there was no one there. When I turned back, the man was gone. My heart was hammering now. He couldn't have walked away that quickly, not without me hearing his footsteps or the squeak of his shoes on the linoleum. It didn't make sense. I spun around again, half expecting him to pop up behind me, but all I saw was the same eerie emptiness. That's when I caught movement out of the corner of my eye, just a flicker, like something darting past at the end of the aisle. I froze. The tapping was louder now, faster. It wasn't just nails on metal anymore. It sounded like it was coming from the air vents overhead, skittering back and forth like something was inside them. Something big. I took a shaky breath and told myself to get it together. This was Walmart, not a horror movie. There had to be an explanation. Maybe a raccoon had gotten in or some weird electrical issue was messing with the sounds. But the part of my brain that wanted to leave, that part was starting to make a lot more sense. I wasn't about to leave without my ice cream, though. Call it stubbornness or just stupidity, but I told myself I'd grab my pint and get out. No more wandering around. No more staring into dark corners. Just in and out. The freezers were eerily quiet as I walked down the aisle. The tapping noise had faded again, which should have been a relief, but instead, it made the silence feel heavier. Every step I took echoed, making me painfully aware of just how alone I was. I reached for the door handle to grab my ice cream. Rocky Road, for what it's worth. But my fingers barely brushed the metal before the lights in the freezer aisle flickered. Not the whole store, just the aisle I was in. A few bulbs buzzed and popped, plunging sections of the aisle into darkness. My breath caught, and I instinctively glanced over my shoulder. That's when I saw him again. The man. He was standing at the other end of the aisle, just outside the edge of the flickering lights. This time I could see him more clearly. His head was tilted so far to the side it looked unnatural, and his arms hung at a strange angle, like they didn't belong to his body. He wasn't moving, but his presence was suffocating. Then I noticed something worse. His face wasn't right. His mouth stretched unnaturally wide, far beyond what should have been possible, like his jaw had unhinged. His teeth, if you could call them that, were jagged and uneven, more like shards of broken glass than anything human. And his eyes, they didn't reflect the light. They absorbed it like twin voids boring into me. I stumbled backward, slamming into the freezer doors. My cart tipped over, spilling its contents across the floor. The sound of boxes and cans hitting the ground should have been loud, but it felt muted, like the air itself was swallowing the noise. The man, or whatever he was, took a step forward. I don't remember thinking. My body just reacted. I bolted down the aisle, past the overturned cart, and ran as fast as I could toward the front of the store. But the tapping was back. It wasn't in the vents this time. It was on the floor, right behind me, matching my every step. No, it was faster. It was catching up. My lungs burned. My legs screamed. But I didn't stop running. The tapping wasn't just behind me anymore. It was all around, echoing through the store like a sinister drumbeat. I could hear it skittering along the linoleum, sharp and irregular, like claws scraping against tile. I burst into the main aisle, desperate for any sign of life. The Walmart greeter was gone. The checkout lanes were deserted. Even the self-checkout machines were eerily silent, their screens flickering with static instead of the usual bright prompts. The whole store felt wrong, like I'd stepped into a version of it that wasn't meant for people. I glanced back, heart hammering. The man, or the thing, wasn't in sight, but that didn't mean I felt safe. The tapping had shifted again, coming from above me now. I stopped under one of the massive overhead lights and looked up. There he was. He was clinging to the metal rafters, his body contorted in ways no human body should bend. His limbs were long and thin, almost spindly, and his head jerked unnaturally as if he was sniffing the air. His face, God, his face, was stretched into that same awful grin, teeth glinting like shards of ice. I didn't wait to see what he'd do next. I bolted for the entrance, my sneakers squeaking against the polished floor. The automatic doors were just ahead, the glass panels reflecting the pale glow of the parking lot lights. I was so close, just a few more steps, and then they didn't open. I slammed into the glass full force, my shoulder jarring painfully as I rebounded off the unyielding doors. The tapping grew louder, closer. I spun around, frantic, and saw him crawling along the ceiling like a spider, his limbs scuttling across the beams with impossible speed. His head rotated toward me, that terrible grin spreading wider as he dropped down with a sickening thud. I scrambled backward, my hands slipping on the smooth floor. There was nowhere to go, nowhere to hide. My mind was screaming, my body frozen in sheer terror as he started to stalk toward me, his movements jerky and inhuman. Just as he reached me, the lights flickered again. For a split second, the entire store went pitch black. When they came back on, he was gone. The tapping had stopped. The air was still. I didn't waste any time. I tried the doors again, and this time they slid open with a mechanical hum. I bolted out into the parking lot, not stopping until I was in my car with the doors locked and the engine running. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely grip the wheel, but I didn't care. I peeled out of that parking lot and didn't look back. I didn't sleep that night. I didn't even make it home right away. Instead, I parked in a gas station lot a few miles down the road, surrounded by the harsh fluorescent glow of the pumps and the steady hum of passing cars. It was the only place that felt remotely safe. My phone buzzed a few times. Texts from friends, a weather alert, but I couldn't bring myself to look at it. All I could do was sit there, gripping the steering wheel, replaying everything that had just happened. By the time I pulled into my driveway, the sun was rising. The orange-pink glow of dawn did little to chase away the lingering dread. My house felt too quiet, the shadows in the corners too dark. Every creak and groan of the old wood floors made my skin crawl. I checked every lock, twice. I even dragged a chair in front of the back door. It was stupid, I knew. Whatever that thing in Walmart was, a lock wasn't gonna stop it. But it made me feel like I had a shred of control. That had to count for something. Days passed, but the unease didn't. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that face. Those jagged teeth, that impossible grin. The tapping sound haunted me, creeping into my thoughts when I least expected it. At work, in the shower, lying in bed at night, I started jumping at every noise, convinced he was there, hiding in the shadows, waiting. Then, a week later, I found something in my car. It was a single fingernail, long, cracked, and yellowed, resting on the passenger seat like a calling card. My blood turned to ice. I hadn't let anyone in my car since that night. Hell, I'd barely been in it myself. I scooped the nail into a plastic bag with shaking hands and threw it in the trash outside. But the damage was done. He'd been in my car. I was sure of it. That night, I heard the tapping again. Started faint, like it was coming from far away. At first, I thought it was my imagination. I'd been so on edge lately, it wouldn't have been surprising. But then it got louder, clearer. It was coming from inside the house. I sat up in bed, every muscle in my body tense. The tapping was coming from the living room, sharp and deliberate. It moved slowly, tapping against the walls, the floor, the windows. My throat tightened as I realized it wasn't random. It was searching. I didn't have a plan. My brain screamed at me to run, but where could I go? If it could follow me from Walmart, if it could find me at home, there was no escape. I grabbed the heaviest thing I could find, a metal flashlight, and crept toward the sound. When I reached the living room, the tapping stopped. The room was empty. The front door was locked, the windows shut tight. Nothing was out of place. I stood there, flashlight raised, my breath shaky and uneven, waiting for something to happen. Then I heard it again, this time from right behind me. I spun around, swinging the flashlight, but there was nothing there, just empty air. My heart pounded as I backed away, my hands trembling so hard I almost dropped the flashlight. The tapping grew louder, echoing from every direction now, like the whole house was alive with it. And then I saw it, reflected in the darkened TV screen. He was standing right behind me, that awful grin stretching across his face. I don't remember screaming, but I must have. The flashlight flew out of my hands as I stumbled backward, hitting the wall hard enough to knock a picture frame to the floor. By the time I turned around, he was gone. Just gone. The room was dead silent. No tapping, no skittering, no shadowy figure in the corner. But I knew better now. Silence didn't mean safety. I grabbed my keys and bolted. I didn't care if I was still in my pajamas or if the neighbors saw me fleeing like a madman. I just needed to get out of that house. I jumped into my car, locked the doors, and drove. Nowhere in particular, just away. As far and fast as I could. It wasn't until I hit the highway that I realized my mistake. The air inside the car felt heavy, suffocating. I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see him in the back seat, but it was empty. Then the tapping started again. It wasn't behind me this time. It wasn't even outside. It was coming from inside the dashboard, like something was crawling through the vents. My knuckles turned white as I gripped the steering wheel, the tapping growing louder, faster, more frantic. I didn't know what to do. Couldn't stop. I couldn't keep going. I was trapped. The sound reached a fever pitch, a chaotic clattering that filled the car, and then it stopped. The silence that followed was worse than the noise. Felt wrong, like the world itself was holding its breath. And then the engine died. The car coasted to a stop on the side of the highway. The lights flickered once, twice, and then went out completely, leaving me in darkness. My heart raced as I fumbled for my phone, its weak flashlight doing little to cut through the gloom. The tapping returned. This time it wasn't just a sound. The windshield began to fog, a thin layer of condensation spreading across the glass. And there, in the center, a single word appeared, written in long, jagged strokes. Mine. I froze. My breath caught in my throat as the car suddenly shook, the entire frame rattling like something massive had landed on the roof. The tapping turned into pounding, hammering against the metal, and I knew, without a doubt, he was above me. My phone slipped from my hands as the pounding grew more violent. The roof groaned under the weight, and I swore I could hear something sliding across the metal, like claws scraping for a hold. I had no plan, no weapon, no hope of fighting whatever this thing was. So I did the only thing I could. I prayed. And then, just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. The car went still, the air eerily calm. I sat there, trembling, afraid to move, to breathe, to blink. Minutes passed, maybe hours. I don't know. When I finally mustered the courage to look outside, the road was empty. No cars. No figures. Nothing. I turned the key in the ignition, half expecting it not to work. But the engine roared to life, the headlights flickering on and casting pale beams onto the deserted highway. I didn't waste time. I drove straight to the nearest gas station, parked under the bright lights, and stayed there until sunrise. That was months ago. I haven't been back to that Walmart or my house. Hell, I moved to another state entirely. But sometimes, late at night, I hear it again. The tapping. Faint. Distant. Like a promise. And I know he's still out there. You'd think that moving states would have been the end of it. New town, new job, new life. A fresh start. But deep down, I knew it wasn't over. Whatever he was, wherever he came from, he wasn't bound to one place. He'd found me once, and he could do it again. At first, everything seemed normal. Quiet. Peaceful. I rented a tiny apartment in a sleepy little town, the kind of place where people still leave their doors unlocked. I even started sleeping through the night again. But it didn't last. The tapping came back. It started one night when I was working late, typing up reports for my job. At first, I thought it was just the radiator or the old pipes rattling. The building was ancient, after all. But then I realized it wasn't random. It was deliberate, spaced out, almost rhythmic, like someone drumming their fingers against the wall. It was coming from the vents. I froze in my chair, every nerve in my body screaming at me to leave, to get out of that apartment. But instead, I just sat there, paralyzed, listening as the tapping grew louder, moving from vent to vent, getting closer to where I was sitting. And then it stopped. I stared at the vent above my desk, my heart pounding so hard I could barely hear anything else. The air was still, the silence suffocating. I leaned forward slowly, gripping the edge of the desk, my eyes locked on the dark grate. My brain screamed at me not to look, but I couldn't stop myself. Something moved. It was just a flicker, a shadow shifting behind the slats. But then I saw it, and dark, glassy, and unblinking, staring down at me from the vent. My stomach dropped, and I stumbled back, knocking over my chair. The grate rattled violently, and I bolted. I didn't even bother grabbing my keys or my phone. I just ran, slamming the door behind me and sprinting down the hallway, out into the cold night air. I stayed at a motel that night, one of those cheap, roadside places with flickering neon signs and musty carpets. The kind of place where nobody asks questions. I thought I was safe there, at least for a little while. But when I walked into the bathroom to wash my face, the mirror fogged over. My breath hitched as a single word appeared, scratched into the condensation. Run. I stumbled back from the mirror, nearly tripping over the edge of the bathtub. My brain screamed at me to leave, to get as far away as possible. But where could I go? He'd already proven he could find me no matter where I was. I couldn't run forever. The motel room was dead silent, but I didn't trust it. I grabbed the room phone and dialed 911, my fingers trembling so badly I could barely press the buttons. The operator's calm voice answered, but I could barely form words. Something's after me. I stammered, my voice barely above a whisper. It's here. The line went dead. I stared at the phone, panic rising in my chest. Before I could try again, the room lights flickered, plunging me into momentary darkness. When they came back on, the word on the mirror had changed. No escape. The tapping started again. It wasn't coming from the walls or the vents this time. It was on the floor, moving toward the bathroom. My heart pounded as I backed into the corner, my eyes darting between the door and the fogged-over mirror. The tapping grew louder, closer, until it was right outside. Then it stopped. I held my breath, every muscle in my body tense. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, slowly, the bathroom door creaked open. There he was. He stood in the doorway, his head tilted at that unnatural angle, his jagged grin splitting his face. His limbs were longer now, impossibly thin and angular, like they'd been stretched. His fingers curled around the doorframe, the nails black and cracked, tapping softly against the wood. I couldn't move, couldn't scream. I was frozen, locked in his gaze as he stepped into the room, his body jerking with every movement like a broken marionette. And then he spoke. His voice wasn't human. It was layered, distorted, like static and growls blending into words. Why run? I finally found my voice. What do you want? I choked out. His grin widened, impossibly so. You! Every instinct screamed at me to run, but my legs wouldn't move. I was rooted to the spot, staring into that impossibly wide grin, those black, empty eyes. His body twitched as he stepped closer, the tapping of his nails echoing in the tiny bathroom. You don't belong here, he rasped, his voice scraping against my brain like nails on a chalkboard. But you stayed. You stayed too long. I didn't understand what he meant. My mind scrambled for meaning, for anything that would make this nightmare make sense. I don't know what you're talking about, I stammered. I didn't do anything. The thing tilted its head even further, a grotesque mockery of curiosity. You looked. It hissed. You saw. You shouldn't have seen. Suddenly it lunged. I threw myself to the side, narrowly avoiding the swipe of his clawed hand. His nails raked the wall, leaving deep gouges in the plaster. My body moved on autopilot, fueled by pure terror. I bolted out of the bathroom, slamming the door shut behind me. But I knew it wouldn't hold. The tapping started again, this time on the bathroom door. Slow, deliberate, taunting. I grabbed the room key and fled. The hallway stretched endlessly in both directions, the dim, flickering lights casting warped shadows on the walls. The air felt heavy, oppressive, as if the building itself was alive and watching me. I ran toward the lobby, my bare feet slapping against the stained carpet. The tapping followed, echoing off the walls, getting faster and closer. I didn't dare look back. When I reached the front desk, it was empty. The clerk was gone, the computer screen blank. The neon open sign in the window flickered weakly. I banged on the bell, screaming for help, but no one came. The tapping was louder now, right behind me. I spun around, expecting to see him standing there, but the hallway was empty. The air was still, too still. And then I felt it, a breath, cold, damp, brushing the back of my neck. I turned slowly, my heart hammering in my chest. He was there, inches away. His grin stretched across his face, those jagged teeth glinting in the dim light. His eyes bore into mine, and for a moment the world seemed to stop. Mine, he whispered, his voice a guttural growl. But before he could move, the neon sign behind me buzzed loudly, flooding the room with blinding light. The creature recoiled, letting out a guttural screech that rattled the walls. His form twisted and contorted, the shadows around him writhing like living things. And then he was gone. I stumbled outside, gasping for air, the cold night stinging my skin. The parking lot was empty, eerily silent. My car was still there, the driver's door wide open as if it had been waiting for me. I didn't hesitate. I jumped in, started the engine, and peeled out of there, not stopping until I was miles away. It's been weeks since that night, and I still don't understand what happened. I've done everything to avoid him, staying in crowded places, keeping every light on, never letting myself be alone. But sometimes, late at night, when the world is quiet and I'm sure I'm safe, I hear it again. The tapping. And I know he's waiting. You'd think by now I'd have learned how to avoid the dark, how to keep the lights on, stay in public, never let myself drift into that eerie solitude where he thrives. But no matter how careful I was, no matter how much I tried to keep moving, he always found me. Started small as it always does. A faint tap at the edge of my hearing. A flicker of movement in a reflection that disappears when I look. I tried to ignore it, convince myself it was nothing. But ignoring him only made him bolder. Last night was the worst yet. I had holed up in a 24-hour diner, the kind of place with sticky booths and waitresses who call you Han. I figured the constant buzz of the neon sign outside, the hum of the coffee machine, and the chatter of the late-night crowd would keep me safe. But around 3 a.m., the crowd thinned, and the noise dulled to a quiet murmur. That's when I felt it, the familiar heaviness in the air. It was like the room itself was holding its breath, waiting. The waitress passed by my booth, and I wanted to grab her arm, beg her to stay, but the words stuck in my throat. The tapping started at the window. I turned, slowly, my breath hitching in my chest. Outside, the parking lot was empty. Just a few cars under the flickering streetlights. But the tapping didn't stop. It moved, circling the diner, from window to window, like something was pacing just out of sight. I gripped the edge of the table, my knuckles white. The tapping grew louder, more insistent. The fluorescent lights above me flickered, casting strange shadows across the floor. I felt a chill creep up my spine, and then I saw it, his reflection. In the glass of the window, faint and distorted, but unmistakable. That grin, those jagged teeth. He was there, watching me. I bolted for the counter, shouting for help, but the waitress and the cook were gone. The diner was empty. I spun around, panic rising, as the tapping grew louder, faster, almost frantic. And then the lights went out. The darkness was absolute, suffocating. I fumbled for my phone, desperate for any source of light, but my hands were shaking so badly I could barely unlock the screen. When the flashlight finally clicked on, the beam illuminated the booth where I'd been sitting. He was there, sitting in the booth, his long, angular body folded awkwardly into the small space. His head tilted impossibly far to one side, his grin stretching wider than ever. He didn't move, didn't speak. He just stared at me, his black, empty eyes drilling into my soul. I stumbled backward, my flashlight shaking wildly, and then he stood. His movements were jerky, unnatural, like a puppet on frayed strings. He stepped toward me, his long fingers reaching out, the nails clicking against the counter. And then he stopped. He tilted his head the other way, his grin faltering for the first time. His eyes flicked past me, toward something I couldn't see. The air grew heavier, colder, and for a moment, it felt like the entire diner was caught in a vacuum. Then I heard it, a low, guttural growl. Not from him, from somewhere behind me. I didn't turn around. I didn't need to. Whatever it wasn't him, and it wasn't here to save me. I was caught between two horrors, neither of which I could hope to escape. The lights flickered back on, blinding me for a split second. When my eyes adjusted, the diner was empty. No tapping, no growling, no grinning figure in the booth. But I know better than to think it's over. I'm writing this now while the sun is still up, because I don't know how much time I have left. He's still out there. I feel him watching, waiting. And now, so is whatever was in that diner. I've learned one thing for sure. Some things don't stop. Some things don't leave you alone. And some things don't want to share. You'd think I'd be numb by now, that I'd accepted my life as a walking nightmare, always waiting for the next tap, the next flicker, the next unholy grin. But the truth is, the fear never dulls. It sharpens, carving deeper into your mind with every encounter, leaving you raw, exposed. And now I know it's worse than I thought. A week after the diner incident, I started noticing the signs. At first, they were subtle, headlights in my rearview mirror that stayed just a little too long, shadows stretching in ways they shouldn't, faces in crowds that were just wrong. But then it escalated. It was a Tuesday when I found the word share scratched into my bathroom mirror. The same jagged, uneven letters. The same message scrawled across the condensation. Only this time, it wasn't just from him. There was another set of scratches underneath, smaller, but just as menacing. Oh, you are. I don't know why I ran, but I did. I grabbed a bag, threw in whatever I could carry, and bolted. It wasn't until I reached the edge of town that I noticed the tapping again. Faint at first, like it was testing the air. Only this time it wasn't just one rhythm. It was two. I kept driving, unsure of where I was going, unsure of what I was running from. Or two. The roads felt endless, stretching into an abyss of flickering streetlights and the occasional, haunting glow of a gas station sign. Every time I stopped, the tapping started again. I'd hear it in the walls of motel rooms, the trunks of cars parked nearby, even the vents of my own car. And then I saw them. It was just past midnight when I pulled into a desolate rest stop, the kind of place where the air feels thick with silence. I was trying to convince myself I could close my eyes for just a few minutes when I caught movement in the rearview mirror. First, it was just one figure. Tall, lanky, with a head tilted too far to the side. My stomach clenched. It was him. But as I stared, frozen in place, another figure appeared. And another. They stepped into the dim glow of the rest stop lights. Their movements jerky, stilted, wrong. Each of them had that same unsettling grin, those same black, empty eyes. There were 3 of them now. No 4. They were multiplying. I scrambled for the ignition, my hands shaking so badly I almost dropped the keys. The engine roared to life, and I hit the gas, tires screeching as I tore out of the parking lot. But as I glanced back, my heart sank. They weren't chasing me. They didn't need to. They just stood there watching, waiting. Now I'm writing this from a cabin in the middle of nowhere. I found it abandoned, the windows boarded up, the doors reinforced. Feels temporary, like everything else. I don't know how long I can stay here before they find me again. The tapping hasn't started yet, but I know it's only a matter of time. I've tried to piece it together to figure out what they want, why they're multiplying. The answer's always the same, OURS. It isn't just one anymore. It's many. And they aren't just after me. They're after all of us. I don't know how long I've been in this cabin. Days? Weeks? Time doesn't work the way it used to. Every creak of the old wood, every rustle of the wind outside feels like it's them. I've barely slept, too afraid to close my eyes for longer than a few minutes. The tapping started again last night, on the roof this time. Slow, deliberate, and far too close. I can feel them closing in. I thought I could wait them out. I thought maybe they'd lose interest, move on to someone else. But I was wrong. They don't give up. They don't stop. They're patient. And now I think they're inside. It started just after sunset. The woods around the cabin had gone eerily silent. No birds, no wind, just the heavy stillness of something watching. I bolted every door, checked every window, but I knew it wouldn't matter. They wanted me to feel trapped. The first sound came from the attic, a soft, rhythmic tap, like something testing the strength of the floorboards. I stayed perfectly still, gripping the fire poker I'd found in the corner, my breath shallow. The tapping moved, slow and deliberate, toward the trapdoor that led to the main room. Then it stopped. I tightened my grip on the poker, my pulse pounding in my ears. For a moment, there was only silence. And then, the trapdoor creaked open. The air in the room seemed to freeze. My eyes locked on the dark square of the attic hatch as a long, spindly hand curled around the edge. His hand. But it wasn't alone. Another hand appeared, then another, until 3 of them were crawling down like grotesque spiders, their grins stretching impossibly wide. I backed into the corner, swinging the poker wildly. "Stay back!" I shouted, my voice trembling. They didn't stop. Their movements were jerky, inhuman, their heads tilting unnaturally as they approached. My back hit the wall, and I knew there was nowhere left to run. The tapping started again, louder now, echoing through the walls and floor. I realized too late that they weren't alone. The shadows in the corners of the room began to shift, more figures emerging, their black eyes gleaming in the dim light. This was it. This was the end. Or so I thought. Just as they closed in, the air in the cabin changed. It grew colder, heavier, suffused with a low, vibrating hum that seemed to come from everywhere at once. The creatures froze, their heads snapping toward the door as if sensing something I couldn't. Then I heard it, a growl, deep, guttural, and inhuman. The door burst open, splinters flying, and a massive shadow filled the doorway. I couldn't make out its form, but its presence was suffocating, a primal force that made the creatures recoil. The thing in the doorway moved with terrifying speed, slamming into the grinning figures, scattering them like ragdolls. The cabin erupted into chaos. Snarls, screeches, the sound of wood splintering and glass shattering. I pressed myself against the wall, watching in stunned horror as the two forces clashed. When it was over, the cabin was silent again. The grinning creatures were gone, the tapping replaced by the soft creak of the wind through broken windows. The shadow in the doorway turned toward me, its form shifting, indistinct. For a moment, I thought it might come for me next. But instead, it backed away, disappearing into the woods as silently as it had come. I don't know what it was or why it helped me. Maybe it wasn't help. Maybe it just didn't want to share its prey. Either way, I'm still here, still breathing. But I can't stay. The cabin is wrecked. The wood's no longer safe. I'm leaving tonight, driving until I can't anymore, until I find somewhere they can't reach me. If such a place even exists. But deep down, I know the truth. They're still out there. And so is whatever drove them away. Some doors, once opened, can never be closed. And some nightmares, once seen, never leave.